Alrighty, so tracking is usually referring to analyzing a motion inside of a video and then representing that motion in some sort of way. Either by maybe just following a point and then we can attach something to that point, or by analyzing the motion of a phone screen so we can then replace the phone screen, or even analyzing the motion of the entire camera inside of a three-dimensional surrounding and then being able to attach elements in 3D space. Like the one example I showed you the other class with the flowers, and then there were these screens popping up above the flowers. We will start with sort of a technically more complex example. However, it's much easier for us to do. This is the source footage. We see first it's a fairly shaky hand motion because it was just me filming with my phone. What we will first do is we will stabilize it, and then we will replace a poster in the background, and we will also add a reflection onto it afterwards. So again, this is the before, kind of shaky, and we can see there's nothing really in here. Or there's stuff in there, but we want different stuff. And then we stabilize it and replace the content here with whatever we want it to be. So this is done with the help of tracking. Another example that we will do later is this footage here. Not sure why, but no. And this is, I'm even less sure why. So, yeah, that's what we will do. We'll start with the bus stop example, and I will first show you a way of tracking that we will not follow up further, but just so you see, this is sort of the standard way of how tracking is done usually, and then I will show you more practical ways. Alrighty, so let's start After Effects. Whenever we do tracking, what we always need to be aware of is the frame rate that our footage has. As you might know, there are different frame rates. So we usually work with 25 frames per second, but there are also other video formats that have 24 frames per second or 29.97 and so on. There are many different ones. And whenever we track something, we have to make sure that our footage exists inside of a composition that has exactly the same settings, mainly the same frame rate as our footage that we want to track. The reason is that when we track something, After Effects thinks in frames of the composition and not in frames of the source footage that we want to track. So when we have a composition that says, I have 25 frames per second, then it can track in 25 frames per second. If we then, however, drop in footage that is maybe 29.97 frames per second, then the source footage has more images than our composition can handle. So, at random, sort of, it will skip. At random, it will skip a couple of frames in between, which means that A, the video will not play back smoothly inside of our composition because the frame rate is different, and also the track might jump weirdly in ways that we don't expect it to. So, very important, whenever we track something, we make sure that we track inside of a composition that has the same frame rate. Here, with the bus stop example, I will do the steps first. I drop it into the project panel, and right away, I can double check here if my settings are correct. And this footage works with our default settings. So we have the 1920 by 1080, and we have a 25 frames per second setup up here. So here, everything is fine. But just to be sure, I create a composition based on this footage item. To do that, I will drag the footage from the composition panel down onto the new composition icon. Alternatively, for the pro users, if you already have a none composition open because you have a new project, you can also drop it directly in here and it will end up with the same thing. It creates a composition that has exactly the same settings. So if I compare it, 1920 by 1080, 25 frames per second, also the length, 5 seconds and 13 frames, and here I have exactly the same settings. The only difference that I see here is that right next to the size here, it also shows me a second size. This size refers to the size that it shows up in my editor right now because I've set my resolution to half. So this just means the original size is 1920 by 1080, but right now it's showing at 960 and 540 pixels. So if I change my resolution here to a quarter, bless you, then it also shows me here the smaller version, and if I set this to full and I update this, then it will show me nothing behind it except for the 1, which refers to the aspect ratio of the pixels, which should always be 1. Alright, so now I have my footage here, and let me first show you how a classic track was done in After Effects, sort of back then. It still can be done the same way, but it's sort of old school and it's not really that practical. There are more practical ways of tracking elements. To track something, you could go to Window and go to the Tracker panel. Inside of the Tracker panel, we then have 4 options. Although they are not really 4 options, they are rather 3 options. So Track Motion and Stabilize Motion, they sort of do the same thing. They just handle the output differently. Then we have Track Camera, which is what we will use in our example here. And we have the Warp Stabilizer, which we'll also use in our example here. But let's first see what happens when we hit the Track Motion button. We can see that something happened here. I'm not in the Composition panel anymore. I'm in the Layers panel, and I can see its own timeline for the layer. Then I can see how a track point is generated. A track point, it consists of 3 different things. We have a search region, a feature area, and kind of a cross in the center. And let me zoom in here so it looks a little bit nicer, like this. What this tracker does is, the cross represents the output. So this is the position that we will get later on. So we can convert it to a null object and maybe parent a text to it. This region sort of copies the contents, and in the next frame it will look for this content within this area here. So I could drag this thing here to an area that has lots of information that is easily found later on. For instance, here I have this sort of cross. Now maybe I take the front one. That one is probably not in later on. And what I'm saying is I have this T shape, and look for this T shape in the next frames. If the camera motion is fast and this T jumps further than this distance here, so if the T suddenly gets over here, then the tracker will not find it anymore, because the tracker is only looking for this feature within this area here. We would then just say that we want to track forward. If I track 1 frame forward, and maybe a second, third, fourth, and fifth, we can see how it creates this sort of trail, how it created a keyframe for every position that it found this element in. If I hit the play button, it will track continuously, and we can see how it's now following that motion. If I now drag through, I can see how I have a fairly complex motion path of that feature. This information, this position change, can now be applied to an element, for instance, a null object. Have we worked with null objects in After Effects before? No. So null objects in After Effects are kind of similar to null objects in Cinema. However, in Cinema we usually use them either to align things like we did with the bike, or just to group things together. In After Effects we know that there are no groups. So a null object is rather used to store information, so we can then connect other things to that information. So here I have this null object. Maybe I rename it, I hit enter, and I call this one track. I will then go back to my tracker panel, and I will go to the edit target. A pop-up pops up, and it asks me what the layer should be. And I will say the layer that the track should be applied to is my layer called track. I hit OK. Then I have some additional options, but I'm not really interested in them. And then hit apply. It then asks me if I only want to apply one axis or both axes, and I hit OK. Now I have a null object that does the same thing that the tracker did. So it follows with its anchor point the position of the feature that I've tracked. Now that I have this motion, I can just create some text, for instance. And I can parent my text to the null object. So now the text will do whatever the null does. And the null is following that feature that I've tracked. Kind of makes sense? All right. Now, what we then realize is, all right, so I've tracked the point, but this is kind of shaking around because we did not track the rotation. We only tracked where that one specific point was going. So we don't know how the element should change in scale or rotation. You could do that by adding a second track and connecting the two tracks and telling the tracker to export also scale and rotation data. But then this is already too many steps that we don't want to do. For tracks like these, for example, when we just want to add a font to something, it's much better to actually use Mocha. Mocha is a separate program that always ships together with After Effects. And we will use that one in this scenario here. Because here, for instance, we don't really have specific points that we could track. These are all just blurry organic things that go into one another. And what a point tracker, this is a point tracker that we used here, does is it needs to look for a specific feature that has a high contrast. So you can clearly find it from one frame to the next one. And in this example here, for instance, we hardly have any clear features, especially if I want to add something to this area here. It will be very hard for a point tracker to figure out how that motion is going. And that's when a planar tracker is needed. However, a planar tracker is something that we will talk about later. What we'll do in this example here is we will actually do a 3D track. A 3D track is sort of like a point tracker on steroids. So instead of us telling the program, these are features that it should track, it will just randomly shoot hundreds, thousands of points onto the scene and then track those. Some of them it can track better, some of them it loses, and then we'll just throw them away. So it does this feature track that we just did here with this corner with a lot of elements in our scene here. So we'll look for areas of contrast and we'll try to track them. Then it has hundreds of position changes, of paths, and it can then compare these paths together and analyze how the three-dimensional relationship between these positions is. And based on that, it can then detect where's the camera, what is the view of the camera, and how is the motion of the camera. And it can even place those points that it tracked in 3D space. Very fancy stuff. And it's all based on this point tracker here, but it's all automated. Let me quickly show you what that does. I will only do it on a quarter, because when we apply this, it will only use a quarter of the resolution to track, and then it should go quite a bit faster. Maybe I only also do it for 2 seconds. And I will apply the camera tracker. I can either click on the track camera button here, or I can look for the camera tracker here. Once it's applied, I will get this notice bar that tells me analyzing in background, and in the top left corner, I will see that it's initializing the tracker, and then it will start analyzing from frame to frame. It will give me an estimate of how long it will take, and it will switch between that estimate and how many frames it already has tracked. The 3D tracker has a couple of properties here. I can, for instance, give the tracker some information so it can track a little bit more accurate and faster. Why is it taking so long? There we go. So here I have chosen 51 frames, and you can see it's now at 35%, 50. Yeah, this is now going so fast that it's not even bothering me to show the time. Now that the 3D track is done, I can see how a couple of colorful sort of flowers appeared. These flowers can be shown a little bit larger by going to the target size and increasing this. That was the lights, the other one, the track point size. As we increase this, we also already get a feeling of the 3D position of them, because the elements that are closer to the camera are larger and the elements that are further away are smaller. If we then play this back, we can see all the sort of point tracks it did where it was pretty confident that those are the correct points, that it did something good. Some of those points disappear over time and get replaced with points that are close to that area, and some of them are here all the time. Now let's take our text example again that we used earlier. So I can see it detected a point that is moving along with the top area here. You should be careful with the points that you select. So you might think, I see this green cross, and it's kind of in this area that I want. But if we play back, we can see how the green cross is actually for something that is much further in the background. So it's not moving exactly along with our element. Things that are more on the plane that we want to track is, for instance, the purple one here. The purple one here in the beginning seems to be exactly where we want something to be. I can then right-click on it, and I can say that I want to either create a text and a camera, a solid and a camera, or a null and a camera. In this case, I want to create a text. I can then see that it created a 3D camera as well as my text. The text right now is fairly small, so let me make that one a little bit larger, like this. If I now play back, I can see how that text is now attached to the top of the bus stop. The nice thing is that there are no keyframes. So my text here has no keyframes. If I do, nothing. Because this is not animated. What is animated is the 3D camera. To prove this, we can switch from our active camera view here to, for instance, the custom view 1. And if we zoom out a little bit here, we can see how we have a camera that's moving in 3D space. So this is me. And we have a text that is back there. So if I rotate around here a little bit, we can see how the text is back there, it's static, and only the camera is moving around. And if we look through the camera and we place the video in the background, it then looks like the text is attached to the bus stop. Kind of makes sense? Awesome. All right. So this is pretty much what we want to do. We want to track this footage. Yeah?
May I ask you why I should choose the first one?
Never.
In which situation?
Almost never.
Okay, thanks.
So in scenarios like this, where we don't have moving elements, where we only have a static scene and a camera that's moving around, then the 3D camera tracker is perfect. It's super easy to use, and it gives me so much control over where I want to place my elements, and I don't need to connect things. Everything just, I place it and it works. In other scenarios where we don't have a static scene and a moving camera, like when we have a phone where we want to replace the screen, for instance, there the 3D camera tracker does not work, because it cannot track moving elements. It can only track a static scene and the motion of the camera.
I'm moving the phone.
Exactly, but if you're moving the phone, then the tracker is confused. What should it do? Shall I track the phone? Shall I track the background? But it cannot do both at the same time. In those scenarios, we would then use Mocha, which is something that we'll do later today. The point tracker is really kind of the last resort if for some reason you don't have a plane that you can track and really, literally only a point. Then the point tracker makes sense, but this hardly ever happens. So in 99% of the times, you can either use the point tracker, the 3D tracker or Mocha. All right, so let me quickly talk about the settings that we have in the 3D tracker. Then I will show you how we can, bless you, how we can stabilize the footage first before we track it, and then we will do the actual example. So in the 3D tracker, we can see how we can give it a shot type. And there are only two types, essentially. It's either a fixed angle of view or a variable zoom. So if you know that you filmed it with an DSLR and you zoomed into something, you can already tell the program that there is a variable zoom. Otherwise, if you know you filmed it with a phone or you did not change the zoom of the lens, then you say fixed angle of view. If you already know which angle of view you had, for instance, 18 millimeters, then you can already put this in. Then the track will be even more accurate. But in most cases, setting this to either fixed or variable should be fine, and it detects it quite well. Next, here's just like what sort of things it can show us, but we usually want it to be on the 3D solved option. We can render the track points, so you can see if I deselect the element, the points disappear, because these points are directly connected to the camera tracker. So only when I select it, I see these points. However, I could also say that these points should actually be rendered out. So when I activate this option and I now deselect it, I see these points all the time. And if I do, for instance, a hue and saturation, they also get affected by it. So here I can see they are really rendered into my footage and get affected by effects. But if I say that they should not, you can see even though the hue and saturation is applied afterwards, if I select it, I'd still see them colorful because they are just virtual things that only show up when I select the effect up here. Then we have the track point size, which sometimes can help if your scene is detected as very large, then these points are shown very small. And then we have down here the advanced options. In most of the times, in most of the cases, we can keep it on auto detect, but they are essentially three different types a scene can be. We either have typical, mostly flat, and tripod pan. Typical means we have a camera that's really moving around. Like in this example, I'm literally moving the camera from one place to another so that I have a parallax motion. Do we know what a parallax motion is? So like, I see this element here, but as the camera moves, I now start to reveal other things behind it. So this element here moves faster than that one here. That's a parallax motion. Also in web, when we scroll something and one element is faster than the other, then we have a parallax scroll. And when we have a parallax motion, then we have a typical track. If we have a mostly flat scene, that's mainly just like your camera is here and it's pretty much just standing there and just shaking a little bit around. There might be a little bit of parallax, but there's not that much motion going on. And then we have a tripod pan. A tripod pan gets solved much quicker and very differently. You can already see here, it gives me many, many more points. But a tripod pan expects the camera to stay at a fixed position and only look up and down and to the sides. So there's no parallax motion. It's literally just looking around. Bless you. So when I choose the tripod pan, I can see how I have a lot of points here, and they are all the same size. Because if we don't have a parallax motion, then there's no depth information that the tracker can find, because nothing is moving in relationship to one another. We only have a view that's changing up and down, and that contains no 3D information. So a tripod pan can be calculated very quickly and also very accurately, but you need to be sure that it actually is a tripod pan. So in most cases, auto-detect should be fine, but if for some reasons it does not give you the results that you want, for instance, if you have a tripod pan, but you get some weird points that are super small and some that are super large, then I suggest switching the solve method to a tripod pan, and then the results of the tracker should be better. Down here, we can see that it used the method typical, which is correct, and that it has an average error of 0.68 pixels, which is kind of okay. My resolution that I said when I was tracking it was set to 1/4, so it's kind of inaccurate anyways. But what this error means is how sure it is that all the points that it tracked were the correct points. If this value is below 1, we're good. So 0.68 is actually quite a good result. If you feel like the track that you're doing does not give you enough points or is not accurate enough, what you can try is doing the detailed analysis. If you enable this, it forgets everything that you've done with the tracker. So if I click this, it will completely start over. It will delete the track that it did earlier, even though my elements here stay here. But these are now wrong. So, well, they're not wrong. They still are correct in relationship to the footage and what I tracked earlier. But if I now create a new track, I would also need to create a new camera and new elements that I place. Because based on the detailed analysis, it might also detect the depth of the scene a little bit differently. The detailed analysis usually takes longer to calculate because it uses many more points than the standard analysis. So when I now select it, you can see how I now have a lot of more points to choose from. All right? So if you feel like you did not get points where you wanted to get points or not enough points to get an accurate result, then you should try doing the detailed analysis. However, in most cases, not doing it already works fine. Auto-delete points across time should always be enabled. You get less errors that way. And hide warning banner just means if we have a long sequence that we're tracking that's maybe like 20 seconds, 30 seconds long, it can take a couple of minutes for the tracker to finish. And if we are annoyed by this bar in the center, we can just hide the loading bar here, or the information bar. All right. I do not recommend choosing the create camera option. I always recommend selecting a point or points, right-clicking on it, and then telling it to create a text, solid or null, in combination with a camera. We could even go super crazy and select all of our points here. My After Effects might crash. Let's see. And I can say that I want to create 1045 nulls and a camera. If I do that, it will now create a lot of nulls, all with funny different colors. And the cool thing is, if I then go outside of the camera, I can actually see my scene in 3D space. Kind of. But based on the nulls, I can see them. There are other programs that can create an even denser point cloud than this. So you can really see, when you go outside of the camera, the entire scene. Cinema 4D, for instance, can do that. So in Cinema, we can track something, and it can create so many feature tracks and points that when we create a point cloud, we can go outside of the camera and we can see a 3D scan, sort of the scene. can explore that in one of the cinema classes. In After Effects, we're not so much interested in all this 3D geometry stuff. We're more interested in just there are points there, and it should just fit somehow, and then we're good. All right, so we are almost done here. It's getting a little bit slower, but we're getting there. All right. So now we have a lot of null objects that I see here with these red points. And if I now switch to my custom view, I can see how I have a camera here and a lot of points there. And if I now navigate around, I can see how I clearly have these top ones here with these, where we had the metal things. And as I move around here, we have the bus stop here. And all these points are aligned in 3D space. Yeah, After Effects is not so good with handling so many points. So it's kind of getting slow here. Yeah, we don't really get that nice of a feeling here. But you get the idea. So all these points are placed in 3D space. So we can now attach elements to those points.
Can this be created by adding a 3D object and just mapping the object?
What do you mean by mapping the object?
This is analyzing a 3D image, right?
Yes?
So what if I add a 3D object?
You can add a 3D object in here, but not in After Effects, because After Effects does not really support 3D formats. So we cannot say we have, for instance, an OBJ or something or an FBX and just drop it in here. After Effects only supports our 2.5D layers. But what we could do, for instance, is we could take what we've analyzed here with After Effects and export it to Cinema 4D. And then we have all these points and the camera inside of Cinema 4D, and we can then place 3D objects in there, render them out, and putting them back into After Effects. So that is possible. However, then it might be much easier to actually use the tracker that is also inside of Cinema 4D. So in After Effects, we use this 3D tracker to create planes or just simple tracks for us. All right. But before we track this, the first thing that we want to do is get rid of the shaky camera here, because that just looks unprofessional. And we do that with the warp stabilizer. When we click that button, we get a similar information box here, and we have the warp stabilizer VFX. I don't know why it's called like that. I think they just thought it sounds cool. Yeah, let's call it warp stabilizer. No, that's not enough. It needs to sound much cooler. Yeah, VFX usually stands for visual effects. So it's like, why? You're not even doing visual effects with this. You're just stabilizing footage. I don't know. Anyways, when we have it applied, it will analyze the footage. It does something similar than like the 3D tracker, but instead of analyzing the 3D motion of things, it analyzes the motion of all the points, and it tries to smooth them out. So instead of having every point moving around shakily, it tries to smooth the motion path of it. There are many different methods that this smooth motion can then be applied to our actual footage. Here we have the result. And there are two methods here. We have smooth motion and no motion. No motion means that it literally tries to create no motion, which means if you want to pretend that your camera was on a tripod, but you did not have a tripod and you were just trying to hold it very still, then this is the option that you want to use. This will analyze the motion and gets rid of it completely so the camera stands still. Since we do have a clear motion here, the result will be probably kind of weird if I play this back. Yeah, this does not look healthy.
It looks like if you would look too long at it, you will get a headache.
A little bit. It's a bit trippy here in the corner. So yeah, no. In our case, we do want a smooth motion. Then we can define how smooth it should be. However, 50% in most cases is way, way, way too much. It tries to smooth things that it can't smooth. A smoothness of 50 makes sense if you already have a very smooth motion and you want it to be even softer over a longer period of time. But this is a fairly shaky motion, so I can't make it too smooth. Usually, you are in an area of 10 to 20%, not more. That usually gives you the best results. If we have something like 50 or even 100%, let's just see what happens here. First, I can see it zooms in quite a lot. And when I play this back, it looks a little bit similar to what we saw earlier. It actually doesn't work too bad. But we do start to see that there's a little bit of weird morphing going on here in the top left corner, how it's kind of like shifting a little bit like this. But still, pretty cool that we can go from this to this.
Does the video itself get slower?
No,
If there would be like a human walking through now, it wouldn't be.
it would not be slower. It only goes, we can actually see it here in the background. Behind the glass, there's someone walking, and they're still walking just fine. So smoothness of 100% usually ends up with weird results, and the footage is zoomed in quite a lot. So if I set this to full, it might look a little bit blurry. So before it might have been nice and sharp, but then it's scaled up so it loses a little bit of its sharpness. So what we rather want to do, let me switch this back to a quarter, is choose something between 10 and 20. In this example, I found 20 works fine. It does not crop too much, so if I see here the before and after, it still crops a little bit, but not as much as it did before, and it still preserves a little bit of the original motion, so there's still a little bit of a natural shake, but it's not this super step shaky thing. Actually, we can even do less. Let's see, 10. Even less cropping, still a smooth motion, but we still have some nice natural camera shake here. Yeah, so let's maybe stick to 10. Then we have different methods. The default method is the subspace warp, which is the method that you should preferably use. What it does is it can really warp the image around in order to get a smooth motion. This means that we can get in corners some weird warping effects, but it can also get rid of, how are they called? Rolling shutter ripple effects. Do we know what a rolling shutter is? A rolling shutter effect is why? Yeah, here for instance. It sort of distorts an element. This is how we would expect a car to look like when it's moving forward, but this is the result that we actually get sometimes. A rolling shutter effect happens because in a camera we have the sensor, and the sensor is not always lit all at the same time. Instead, it sort of rolls a small area open, and then the sensor is scanned. So while the shutter rolls, the object is moving. So at the bottom of the sensor, it is back here. So this one starts at the top. And then the further down it goes, the further the car has already moved to the right. There are also other cameras where this effect sort of happens, because the sensor, when it's being read, is not being read at the same time. So for instance, in phone cameras, we have the same issue, but there it's not because it's lit from top to bottom, but it's read from top to bottom. So the sensor is read slower than the object is moving. So when we have a cell phone camera and it's jumping around, we sometimes have these really weird, distorted elements. And this is called rolling shutter, which can also result in some really funky results. But mainly we have something like this, where elements are just weirdly tilting to the sides. And this can already be eliminated with the subspace warp, because it really just warps the image into a smoother motion and therefore also gets rid of the rolling shutter. There's also in the advanced options here an option to say that it should do enhanced reduction. So if you know that you have rolling shutter, you can tell it there is rolling shutter and please take care of it. And also here we do have a detailed analysis, which then again takes longer but might be more accurate, but not always. Sometimes it tries to stabilize in too much details, and then instead of getting a smooth motion, we have a weird jerky motion. So with the 3D tracker, we usually always have better results with the detailed analysis. However, with the warp stabilizer, sometimes we actually get better results with the standard method, and the detailed analysis gives us weird artifacts that we don't want. There are a couple of more things that we can do in the stabilizer, but for today, I think this is enough information. So always choose subspace warp and choose a smoothness of 10 to 20 and never use the 50, because that in most cases gives us weird results. What we will do now is we will import the footage, create a composition, we will stabilize it. Once it's stabilized, we will pre-compose it. The reason is, if I say, all right, so I have this warped, I have the stabilizer here, and I then apply the 3D camera tracker, it will then say, a warning. 3D camera tracker analysis ignores masks and effects applied in the same composition. To honor them, apply them in a pre-composition. All right, so when this is done, I will see how it overwrites the warp stabilizer, and it will show me again the original footage without the stabilization applied. So I need to force After Effects to say, nah, merge this, sort of, and then you can track the result of that. So to merge this, we will right-click on our footage, and we go to Pre-Compose. It's kind of like converting it into a smart object. Then, here it is important to say Move All Attributes. If we say Leave All Attributes, this means it just wraps the layer, but it then applies keyframes, masks, effects to that composition that we have created. If we say Move All Attributes, it will put everything into a new composition. And then that is the result that we want. Leave all attributes in the layer. You hardly ever have to do that. In most cases, you really want to move all the attributes. So when I now hit OK, I can see.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Did you put a tick in the two last boxes of new composition?
Yeah, these elements are sort of optional. So you can say adjust composition duration to the time span of the selected layers, which means if I have, for instance, a new composition and I have some layers that do stuff. And these layers do something from here to here to here to here. So this is what my layers are doing. And I'm like, all right, I'm done with this animation and I want to create more stuff and I don't want them to clutter up my layers here. I can select them, I can right click on them, and I can say pre-compose. When this is not enabled and I hit OK, let's also not open it, I can see it creates a composition that is the entire length of my composition. And when I drag through, at the beginning I don't see my layers, and then the layers pop up, and then they disappear. But I don't really see from when to when they happen. In order to know when they are visible, I actually need to open up the pre-comp, and then I can see these layers again. So if I pre-compose them, and I have that first checkbox checked, it will detect how long are these layers, and it will create a composition that is that same length. So it's much easier for me to handle and adjust.
Do you work a lot with these smart objects and like?
Yes.
Do we use them all the time, or is it
Pretty
more-
much.
Okay, so we use it as soon as it's possible.
Yeah, as soon as you feel like, nah, I have too many layers here, and I have these things where I'm like, this could be my scene 1 from now on, just merge them together.
It's like when we merge layers in Photoshop.
Exactly. Only that you don't really merge them, you can always go inside of them and still edit the original contents. So it's a little bit like a smart object, but much more easier accessible than a smart object.
When I edit them, but not in the big file, but just by themselves, does it like name sign? Does it just relink, or
It's not even relinking, it's just,
I can't edit them without opening the main file?
these are all inside of the same After Effects file. So if we take a look here, the pre-comp that I've created is now here, pre-comp 1.
I can't touch it without opening the main one. So.
Yes, you can. For instance, if I close these tabs down here, so I've created a couple of versions here, I have created this new composition and a pre-comp. I can always close it, and it's still there. So I can see this layer still exists. I can even close this composition, but still these two exist. I could then go, for instance, into my pre-comp 1, and I could say, maybe I add something here. Maybe I add another solid that has a different color, like this, and I place it over here. If I then open up my comp 1, which contains the pre-comp 1, I can see how it's immediately updated. All right? So this here will always be just a link. And a pre-comp is now like a smart object, so I can also use it multiple times. So I could actually scale this down and duplicate it around as often as I want, go inside of this, change something, and then it will be changed for all of them. So literally like a smart object. And working with pre-comps is something that we will do often, especially when we have larger projects. As soon as we have more than 10 layers, we start to pre-comp stuff. Otherwise, we have to scroll too much and things get messy. And certain things are only possible when we do pre-comps. For instance, in our case here, when we do want to track the 3D camera motion based on the stabilized footage. So, after we pre-comped it, we can see how the camera tracker disappeared from the effects controls panel, because if I double click it, it's applied to the layer inside of the pre-comp that we have created. This is, by the way, what I said in one of the first classes. All these compositions are just compositions. And when I say pre-comp, it's still the same thing. But when I call something a pre-comp, this just means it's part of a larger thing. So in my case, for instance, my bus stop, this is my main composition. But the bus stop.mp4 comp 1, where I stabilized it, this is now a pre-comp, because I'm using it inside of the bus stop. I could also use this one as a main comp, since it's the same thing. But just by definition, since I use it inside of here, I would call this one a pre-comp. If I put this into my folder structure here, so if I go to scripts and run the folder script, I would organize it the following. I have the bus stop, which will be my final result here, I put it there, and I also have this other project, my comp 1, in which I have this other pre-comp with animations, supposedly, so this is also a master comp. These two comps, however, are pre-comps, so I put them in here, and the original bus stop footage is a video, so I place it in here. So here, I now have one After Effects file that contains two projects, one where I have the bus project and one where I have the comp 1 with the animation inside. Kind of make sense? Alrighty. Yes. I think you've seen everything. I don't have to do it once and then we do it together. We now just do this together for a couple of minutes. So let's start by starting with a fresh project. If we want to work clean, let's already add the folder structure by going to File, Scripts, and then Folder. We can open up the footage folder, select the video folder, and drop the video inside of there. So the bus stop inside of the video folder. Then, as you might remember, we need to create a composition based on the same properties that our original footage has. So we take the bus stop MP4, drag it down, and you can either drag it into the None field here, or, just to be safe, drop it onto the new composition icon at the bottom of the project panel. It will then open up down here. In order to make sure that the stabilization and the tracking works at the best quality and with the highest accuracy, make sure that your editor here is set to full resolution so that the tracking is always done at the full resolution. Then, with the layer selected, we don't have to open up the tracker panel. It should be enough to just do the Control Tab and look for the camera, the warp stabilizer. This one here.
How do you get this menu?
Selecting the layer and hitting Control Tab. If we still did not install it for you. Did we install it? Maybe we did not set it up correctly. Let me quickly check that. So, we select the layer and we look for the warp stabilizer and we apply it. If you already applied it, it should already be running in the background. I don't think we need to set any additional options in here. No need for a detailed analysis. I think the final result should look fine. You can see here, at the full resolution, it takes much longer than it did for the quarter resolution that I've selected earlier. What we can already do is set a smoothness of 10%, which I think should be enough. If you, after you've done the 3D track, decide, maybe I do want a different smoothness, then you have to repeat all the steps that we do from now on again. Because then you need to do the 3D track again based on the newly stabilized footage, because the camera motion is different. And then you also have to place all the 3D elements differently, because the 3D scene might be detected differently on a differently smoothed footage. Kind of make sense? So, before you do the 3D tracking, make sure that you are happy with what the warp stabilizer gives to you. If we now play this back, it should play back quite quickly. Here, you could quickly also switch to, or temporarily switch to a quarter. It then renders much quicker in here, but it still uses the high quality track from earlier. So after the tracking is done and we don't see this bar here anymore, it's safe to switch the resolution again because it already tracked it and saved the information of the full resolution track.
Is there anything that you need to press to activate the stabilizer, or will it just start
Mm-mm.
instead of
It will just start eventually. So you would have like first a blue bar that says analyzing, and then at some point it's done. It would then show an orange bar that says solving, and then you should be done.
So we choose the smoothness.
A smoothness of 10,
Yep.
and that's it.
Okay.
Then, in order to do the 3D track, let's just double check that our resolution again is set to full. We pre-compose this. We right click on the layer and we choose pre-compose. Alternatively, you could also go to layer and choose pre-compose all the way at the bottom here, or use the shortcut Command Shift C. in this window, maybe we call this one differently, because this name is not really explaining what it is. So here I would call it maybe stabilized. I make sure that move all attributes is selected, and the other options don't matter. I don't need to open it in a new composition because I want to stay in the composition that I am right now. And I also don't need to adjust it since it's already the same length as the composition. So if I choose the first checkbox here or not, in this case, makes no difference. Then we hit OK. If we did everything correctly, when we select the layer, there should be no FX icon here, and when we go to the effects controls, it should be empty. If it's not empty, undo, pre-compose again, and make sure that you say move all attributes. Now that we have our stabilized layer here, we can start the 3D track. So again, Control Tab, and we type in camera, and here we want to choose the 3D camera tracker. Bless you. Once we have it applied, we get the same bar here, and it will start initializing, and then it will do the 3D track. Again, we notice this takes quite a bit longer than the track that I did earlier, because I'm at full resolution. And I also have a longer composition now.
3D camera tracker.
When it's done, you should see these small little dots. If you want to see them a little bit more clearer, what you can do is increase the track point size here. Like so. If you then play through, it should look something like this. So far, so good? All right.
Still 3D camera tracking.
Yeah, that's fine. The next steps I will do first. Afterwards, we will do them together. There's one more small thing that I want to show you that is special about the 3D tracker. We can not only just select a specific point and attach a layer to it, we can also select multiple points and therefore create sort of a plane. I could, for instance, go, what would be a good place? Maybe here. I could select a couple of points that are roughly all on the floor, like this. I can then right-click on it, and I can say that I want to create a solid and a camera. The nice thing about this solid is now that it's aligned precisely with the floor, or it's aligned with the points that I've selected. Because if we just select a point and say create an element, we don't know, or After Effects does not know where should it be looking at. It just knows where it is in 3D space, but it does not know, am I lying on the floor? Am I attached to a wall or something like this? By selecting multiple elements, we can give After Effects the information, this is a plane, and it should be aligned with that plane. So here, for instance, if I make this a little bit larger, I can see how this is nicely following along with my floor. And if I play this back, let me switch to a quarter so it goes a little bit faster. It's now pretty nicely stuck to the floor. So for instance, if I now say I want some text, and the text should lie on the floor like it's printed on it, I could say, all right, so I have this. Let's take, like, do I have... What happened to my Gotham? All right, let's just take Futura. So this is my font. I will make it 3D. It might jump to some other place, but that's fine. What I will do now is I will force this text layer to be where my solid is. So I parent it, but take a look at this info. Hold Shift to move layer to location of parent. Ho-ho. This is kind of like what we do in Cinema, where we place something into null object and then we do the reset PSR. And this is doing this all in one step. So I move the parent pick whip over, hold down Shift, and then I release it. And now my stop is placed exactly where that plane is. The nice thing is that it also takes on the coordinate system of the track solid. If I unparent it, I can see that this is the actual position in 3D space of that object. But this is kind of hard, like so many weird numbers. But if we keep it parented, it shows us the relative position to the parent. So if I want to move it along the parent, I can just say, all right, so I want it more on the left, so I decrease the x-axis. And the y-axis is then this position here, so I can place my text here, maybe give this a different color, maybe it's just sort of a dark gray, and then I set this layer to multiply. And when I now play this back, I have my text printed on the floor. The same thing I will do, but with the points that I have in the back here. I will choose my move tool and I will create a marquee selection, or not really a marquee selection, a lasso selection around these points. Be careful to only choose the points that are in that area. Do not select points back here, because that will alter your position. Or the rotation and the position. If you accidentally select a point that you did not want to select, just shift click on it. With Shift, you can also add points to the track if you want to. So here we could also select them all by just shift clicking on them. Then you right click on them and say create solid and camera. If I deselect it, I now have a solid that sits exactly in that spot. And a camera that does all the animation for me. Then I will place the actual billboard that I want to be inside there. So I take the poster, I add it into the pics folder, and maybe I organize this a little bit nicer, so the bus stop goes into the master comps, and the bus stop stabilize goes into the pre-comps. So now everything is where it's supposed to be. Then I take the poster, drop it inside here, I make it 3D. If I don't see the 3D button, I click the button at the bottom. So enable 3D. It might jump to some other place that does not make too much sense to me. So this origin is sort of chosen at random. It usually is some spot in the world space that the camera meets sooner or later. So here we can see there will probably be one frame, roughly, not really. Anyways, so it's 3D. I parent it to the track solid, but I hold down Shift so it moves to where it is. Then I can make it a little bit larger, maybe switch my resolution here to full, and I can move it into place. Because the layer is pretty far away, when I hold the x-axis and move it around, you can see how it moves much slower than my arrow here. This is natural. Just be careful. When you move a layer in 3D space, just like in Cinema, it moves it based on the camera view unless you hover over a specific axis. So just like we need to be careful in Cinema, we have to be just as careful in After Effects. So when we only want to move it on that same plane to the left, we hover over the x-axis and move it along that axis. Alternatively, you can also hit P and move it on each axis here separately, then we can be even more accurate. Now I can see it detected most of the orientation just fine, just sort of the Z rotation it could not get. Because how is it supposed to, it knows it's kind of like this plane here, but how is it supposed to know if it's like this or that? So this is the last thing that we need to tell it. So on the poster, I hit R, and I change the Z rotation. I hold on the command key to only rotate it slightly, and then it should fit into that area quite well. It does not match 100% though. So I can see that it feels like it's matching in most of the corners pretty well, but there's this one corner where it's like, apparently not so much. This might be because the original footage is not perfectly straight, or because of the distortion of the camera, because we always have a little bit of lens distortion. And After Effects does not incorporate that, so After Effects can only think in straight lines. It cannot create this curvature for us. So what could we do to fix this here? We can actually just fake it with the 2D effect. What would you do in Photoshop if you want to make this match? Now, with the transform tool, Command T, and then we can grab the corners and put them to where they are supposed to be. In After Effects, we have the same tools, and they are even better. My favorite one is called the power pin. So if I select the poster and I look for power pin, I see how I get in each corner a dot that I can move. So when I hover over this dot and I move it around, I can now place it exactly into the corner, into the corner that I want it to be in. So I do that for each corner. So here's where that is supposed to be. This needs to be down here. And this needs to be, apparently much lower. If I then go to the end of my timeline, however, I notice here a little bit of stuff is looking through. Here also it needs to be more to the left. So maybe the track is not perfect. It's pretty good. So when we look at it like this, it looks like it's sticking to it as it should, but apparently it's still shifting just a little bit. So what we do is we just animate the power pin. So at the beginning of the timeline, we say, this is where these corners are supposed to be. So we activate the stopwatches. Then we go to the end of the timeline, and we just adjust the position. And then it will sort of adjust our track with the 2D power pin, and therefore give us a more stable and accurate result. Wow, so much moving around. And this corner was already pretty good. Alrighty. So, when I now play this back, maybe at half, I can see how this sits nicely where it should. And I hardly had to do anything. Well, we still needed to do something, but just imagine we would have to animate this. That would be crazy. All right, let's do this together. We maybe first organize here a little bit. So we drag the bus stop composition into the master comps folder and the bus stop stabilized into the pre-comps folder. Then into the pics folder, we will import the JPEG of the poster. Then we drop the poster into our bus stop composition, and we make sure that it lies on top of the stabilized one.
In my the top left quadrant where you've been able to drop that picture, and I still have the says project, bus stop stabilized, and it's got 3D camera checker. How do you get that to go away?
You just need to switch back to the project panel. So up here you have the effects control selected,
Ah, yes, okay.
and just switch back here. If you don't see it, you can click on the arrows and choose the project panel from there.
Can you repeat?
We drag the poster into the pics folder. Then we drag it from the pics folder into our layer panel down here, like this. Make sure that the poster sits on top of the bus stop stabilized in the hierarchy down here. Then we convert the poster into a 3D layer. Sorry, no, not yet. Now we have it in here. And we need to create a camera and a position where this poster is supposed to be. I forgot that part. So let's hide the poster, select the bus stop stabilized layer, and go back to the effects controls panel. From here, we select the 3D camera tracker, which should then show us all these colorful crosses again. Then we zoom in so we can see all the points here on the information panel. And we click and drag a lasso selection around just those points. If you accidentally select more points, make sure to shift click on them to deselect them, because we only want these points here selected. Kind of like behind them, you should see that there's this red thing. So if I select only 2 of them, or 3, I can see how I get this sort of target icon. It gives me a hint as to where the position will be and which way it's facing. Then you right-click on it, and you choose Create Solid and Camera. Which then, if you deselect it, gives you a colored solid. Yours might have a different color. And when you deselect the entire layer and play back, you should now have that solid on that information panel, and it should follow along with it quite nicely. Alrighty. The last thing is adjusting the rotation and then adjusting the corner pin so that everything fits perfectly. So we hit R for the rotation, and then we change the Z rotation. I suggest holding down the Command key as you click and drag the value in order to rotate it in much smaller increments. So now it fits pretty well in here. Maybe like this. So the last thing is to add the power pin. Yeah?
I don't remember how can I open the X.
R.
Yeah, and I see just position. If I push R.
No rotation and not the other ones.
Yeah.
Are you sure?
If R is
Alright. So for the fine tuning, the effect is called power pin. With the poster selected, we hit Control Tab and we type in power pin. It's called CC power pin. And just like we would do sort of with the corner pin or the warp inside of Photoshop, we can hover over a corner and just move that corner out. Oops. So you should see how these yellow lines are sort of extracting from the original sort of purplish, bluish lines. And then we can place it exactly in the corner where it's supposed to sit. When we're with the placement okay, then we activate the stopwatches, move the slider to the end of the timeline, and readjust the corner positions. And when we then play back, we should have the poster nicely fitting into the back of the bus stop. All right, so let's have the break. If you have issues, I can come around and help you fix it. And in the last step, which we'll do after the break, we will add a nice 3D reflection to this. So it looks nicely integrated, because right now it looks a little bit fake. It moves with the camera, so that is nice, but it just looks too perfect. There are no irritations and the colors are just too strong. I will do the next steps first. Afterwards, we can do them together. So I want to create a reflection, but rendering an actual reflection takes so much render power and is also so complex to set up because I don't really have anything that could be reflected. So what I did some afternoon, I was like, how can I fake a reflection? So I thought about, what is a mirror? A mirror is kind of a thing that lets me look into a second world that is behind the mirror, right? So when I move around, the thing behind the mirror looks like there's actual space there. So instead of placing something closer to the camera or behind the camera that would be reflected, I could just create that space that is behind the mirror and then force it to be viewed in front. This sounds a little bit complicated and it does look a little bit weird in the beginning, but it totally makes sense. So what I do is I duplicate my source footage here. I get rid of the camera tracker, I right-click on it, and I convert it into a still frame by going to Time and say Freeze Frame. If I now single view this and I play it back, I can see that it's not moving, it's just a still image. Just like the back would be. The back would also be kind of a still image. I will then convert it into a 3D layer, and I will place it again where, this time where the poster is. I will then scale that by quite a bit. I hit P for the position, and I move it a lot backwards, like this. So now this is sort of moving where something behind the glass could be. So when I enable this, I can see this needs to be even further back. Like this, and maybe a bit larger. Let's set this to a quarter. So now this image that I've placed, the still image, is kind of as far away as this house in the background, this building. And it also moves just like the reflection would if it's the same house behind me. So what I need to do now is I need to tell this layer to be in front of the poster. Then I need to mask it with the poster, so it's only visible where the poster is. And then I need to screen it onto the poster. So I drag it to the top, but then I realize it's still behind the poster. Because 3D layers ignore the hierarchy here. If they are in 3D space behind each other, then they will stay behind each other. There are only two workarounds. Workaround number one, the cleanest solution, is to create an adjustment layer. The shortcut is Command-Alt-Y. If the adjustment layer is between two 3D layers, they will be split. And even though the bus stop is in 3D space behind the poster, it's now forced to be shown in front. So if I turn the adjustment layer off, it's behind it. If I turn it on, it's forced to be in front. The other alternative is to add a layer effect. When I right click on this and I go to layer styles and go to, for instance, to the drop shadow, it's also forced to be in the front. I can now even turn off the drop shadow and it's still forced to be in front because layer styles are enabled now. But usually the easier solution is an adjustment layer just placed underneath it. Now I just need to mask this out. There are different masking ways, and I think I have not talked about them yet. They are these track mats here next to the blending modes. I can just take the poster that I have, duplicate it, drag it above, and what I can now tell this one here is to look at the layer above and use that one as a mask. So I would choose here Alpha Matte Poster. If I now single view this, this acts like a mirror. Kind of makes sense. So when I unsingle view this, it's now like I'm looking through this. Either there's a mirror or I can see things that are behind it. Then to make this a little bit more abstract, I could hit S for the scale, unconstrain the proportions, and give the first value, my x-axis, a negative value, so my image is flipped. So it shows me a little bit more different things here. Then I just set this layer to screen, so it's screened on top of the layer underneath it. Maybe I want to blur it a little bit, so it's integrated nicer, so it's not such a super sharp reflection. For that, I will add a fast blur. For some reason, they now called it fast blur legacy. So maybe just a blur of 4 pixels. And then I play around with the opacity. And just add it just a little bit. So when I play back, I can feel that there's some other stuff being reflected here. I don't want to clearly see it. I just want to feel that there's some parallax motion, or that there's an additional layer that nicely integrates the poster with the background. And then, to make the illusion even better, I can select the poster and I could add some curves, push up the darks here, so it's not so black, and maybe add a hue and saturation and desaturate it a little bit, so it's not such a super strong red. I could now do a quick before and after to see if I like what I did. To do that, I can hit this button here to take a snapshot. Then I can undo what I did, or I just turn off the hue and saturation, turn off the curves, and turn off the reflection here. And when I then click on the icon next to the snapshot icon, I can toggle between this is where I took the snapshot, and this is the before and the after. And this definitely looks much more integrated than this one.
But this reflection should be the reflection of something that is in front of the poster, right?
Yeah, but I don't have that, so I just take what I get.
Yeah, but I mean, just to understand.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is supposed to be a reflection that is really a reflection, something that is probably behind me.
Yeah.
All right, let's do this together. We start by duplicating the bus stop. On that bus stop, we don't need the 3D camera tracker anymore. So we go to the effects controls, select the 3D camera tracker, and delete it. Then we go maybe to the beginning of the timeline, right-click on the bus stop, the duplicated one, go to time, and we choose freeze frame.
How do I duplicate it?
Command D. Then you right-click, choose time, and freeze frame. So when we now play through, it should look pretty weird because our poster is moving, but the background is not. So far, so good?
Yeah. I deleted the effects.
Did you duplicate the layer first?
Yeah.
Then you right-click on the duplicated layer, choose time, and freeze frame. Then we want this to be a 3D layer as well. And it should be kind of where the poster is. So we take the parent pick whip, choose the poster, hold down Shift, and release the mouse. So now the still frame of the bus stop should be behind the poster, something like this.
Sorry, can you do it again? What's the current?
First, make sure that the layer is 3D. Yeah? Then you take this twirly thing, drag it over to the poster, hold down Shift, release the mouse, then release the Shift key. And then the still frame that we just created should be right behind the poster. So when we drag this a little bit larger, you can see this is where it is. All right?
I have to drag it to the last frame, which is not duplicated. But to the one below, not to the...
You have to take the twirly thing from the duplicated layer, because this is the 3D layer that we want to move to the poster. So you drag the twirly thing from the still frame to the poster while you hold down Shift. And then when we scrub through, the poster should have the still frame sort of closely attached and right behind it.
But my frame is empty.
All right. Next, we want to make the duplicated bus stop quite a bit larger. Maybe to not accidentally confuse it, let's rename it. So we select it, hit Enter, and let's call it reflection. Then we scale this reflection layer quite a bit larger. So we grab one of the corners, hold down Shift, and drag it. Then we want to move it backwards on the z-axis. So we hit P and we want to increase this value. By increasing this value here, the third one of the position, it moves backwards and gets smaller in the process. When we then play it back, we should get this parallax motion.
Can you redo those steps? For mine, when I hit enter after I've selected a name, it did something entirely different, so I got
So you wanted to select the layer that you duplicated and deleted the effect from. Then you hit enter, and then you should be able to rename it. Right?
No, if I highlight it and I hit enter, it still just starts playing the
Next, follow my lead closely. We want to have the reflection in front of the poster. So we drag it in front of the poster in the hierarchy. I suggest dragging it all the way to the top. Then we know that the poster is actually in 3D space in front of it, so we need to force a break. To do that, we hold down Command Alt and Y, which creates an adjustment layer. Alternatively, you can right-click in an empty area, go to New and choose Adjustment Layer here, or you can also go to Layer, New, and choose Adjustment Layer from the list there, or the shortcut Command-Alt-Y. Then the adjustment layer needs to sit between the reflection layer and the poster, so we just drag it underneath the reflection. So far, so good. Now, we just need to make sure that this reflection is only visible where the poster is. So we select the poster, hit Command D to duplicate it, and we move the poster above the reflection. Then we select the reflection layer, click on the toggle button at the bottom so we can see the blending modes. And right next to the blending modes, we have a drop-down that says None. And off the reflection layer, we click on the None drop-down and we choose the first option, Alpha Matte. And this makes sure that it takes the alpha information, so the transparency information, off the layer above it and uses it as a mask. Sure.
Yeah, of course.
When we now play it back, it should look like we have a mirror. Sort of. So far, so good? All right. Now we just need to tell this layer to be screen. So we select the reflection layer and change the blend mode to screen and turn the opacity down a little bit. Maybe just to 10 or 20%. And when we then play back, we have a nice reflection on there.
Which number did you change?
The opacity. The shortcut is T. And of course, the blending mode from normal to screen. Now the last steps are just kind of like beauty touches where we would add a little bit of a blur to the reflection and change the curves and hue and saturation of the poster. But I showed that earlier and I don't want to waste time on that. I rather want to talk for the last 30-40 minutes about Mocha. All right, so this example is done. Are there questions? Good. And we will use the 3D tracker in another example again. So don't worry, we will repeat this one more time because it can be super useful in so many cases. Alrighty, so this example is done. For the second example, I will do it first and we will see if we will do it together. I import the file, and the first thing that I notice is, up here, it is filmed with a different frame rate. So here we have 29.97 frames per second. So now I need to make kind of a judgment call. Either I say, if I have a case film and I need this, that I create the entire case film with this frame rate, or I convert this into a frame rate that I'm used to, and then continue with this video with a new frame rate. For today, to keep it simple, I would say I just keep it at that frame rate and I don't convert it. I will talk about conversion at another time. So I create a composition based on those settings. I can now see I have a new composition which has the 29.97 frames per second. And to track it in Mocha, it's not an effect, it's a completely different program that we open. It's much like cinema. It comes with After Effects, or a version of it comes with After Effects for free, and it's also licensed through After Effects. I go to Animation, and I say, down here, Track in Mocha AE. So here you can also see how we have the other options like Track Camera, Warp Stabilizer, and Track Motion, so the things that we saw earlier, we also have them in here. But this time I choose Track in Mocha AE. It will then launch Mocha, and this is the only way that you can launch Mocha. So literally, you always have to have a layer selected and say, I want to track this. Otherwise, if you try to open Mocha via Spotlight, it does not work. You will get a license error. When you open it, it asks you to register, and you just say, nah, register later. Then it might tell you, do you want to kind of create the initial settings? And then you say, nah, I don't care, because the default settings are fine. And then it says, all right, so here's the new project. We can already see that the interface is very different to the one from After Effects. Well, it's dark as well, but it's still different. What it will do is, by default, it will save a Mocha file right next to where the footage is. So all the settings here should be fine, and I hit OK. And I can see the interface here. When I go back to my folder, I can see how it created a folder called Results. And in here, it saved a .mocha file. So this is what it always does. It creates a new file right next to the file that you want to track with the same name. In this file, it then saves all the things that you do. Let me just show you what it does, and in the meantime, explain the different areas of the interface. The first thing that I need to do is tell Mocha what it should track. It's not like the camera tracker where it just tracks everything, but it's also not as specific like the point tracker. Here in Mocha, I define with a mask what I want to track. So in this case, to add the face on the leaf, I would just create a mask of the entire leaf. For that, I have two tools. I can either use the X-spline or the Bezier. No one that I know uses the Bezier tool because it's lame. So in Mocha, we usually use the X-spline. The X-spline is a little bit like the B-spline in Cinema and the Roto Bezier in After Effects, but something in between. You click to create points, and you can see how each point has this sort of handle next to it. This handle defines the influence of the point. The shorter the handle is, the less influence it has on the path. And the longer it is, the more influence it has on the path. So we have a sharper edge there. In most cases, you don't need to worry about that. You just create these points and just put it there. If you want it to look nicer, you can just hit Command A to select everything and just make it smoother for all of them. So now we have a nice soft mask around here. Maybe this one I make sharp. It's not really that necessary. It's more for my personal aesthetics. So now I've defined an area that Mocha can track. What Mocha has done is it created a layer. A layer has a couple of properties. The first one is it visible or not? Because I can have multiple elements tracked at the same time. I would then have multiple layers. One layer always represents one track. Then the layer has the cogwheel. The cogwheel means should it be tracked or not. So if I have more layers, I could tell these layers to not be tracked. We will talk about that a little bit more in depth when we get there, not today. Layer can obviously be locked. I can change the color of a layer if I wanted to, but I just keep it the red color. Then if we go further down, here we actually define what sort of settings do I want for the track. So first we have the input clip, which is the one clip that we have imported. Then we can say what is the input channel. We can either track the luminance, or we can say that it chooses automatically which channel has the highest contrast. So luminance just takes an average of all the three channels, so R, G, and B, and it tracks based on that information. But if we have something like the leaf, it might be better to maybe choose the blue channel because it might have a higher contrast, because here's just a lot of green. So in the luminance, there might not be as much information as just in the blue channel. So if you feel like you have a fairly plain surface, there's not much detail there, you can try choosing auto channel, but it will be much slower. Then we have the minimum percentage pixels used. This means how many percent of the pixels inside of this area is actually being used to be tracked. So it kind of works like the feature tracker, where it's like, I have this feature and I look where this is in the next frames. But a feature tracker only changes the position. It can only analyze how does this feature go from here to here in the position. Mocha is a so-called planar tracker. So it tracks everything what this does, but always based on a planar surface. So it can detect how it rotates, how it scales, how it moves, and even how it distorts in 3D space. But always assuming that it's a flat surface. But the leaf is pretty flat, so this should be fine. If I increase this value, it will use more pixels here. If I drag this to 100%, it would also use pixels that I don't want it to use, like these ones here. These pixels here obviously belong to the background, so I don't want Mocha to track those. So with these ones here, with this value, we define how many pixels Mocha can just throw away. If we are pretty sure that we have a very flat surface, there are no reflections, there are no shadows crossing it, no elements crossing it, there's nothing else behind it, then we can use very high values. If you have something like this, where there might be shadows irritating it, or we have an inaccuracy in our mask here, then we rather want to use lower values. Lower values usually mean a little bit less of an accurate track, but also a faster track. So when I have a high value, it takes very long to track from one frame to the other, because there are more pixels that need to be evaluated. But if we have a lower value, it goes much faster. Here's my favorite part of Mocha. If I want to change this value, I don't click and drag left and right. I click, I move my mouse up, and then I rotate it like a clock around the point that I clicked on.
That's weird.
But think about it, this makes the most sense. Like especially when you have a tablet, How often do you drag a slider and you reach the end? And you have to drag again and again. And with this, you don't have this issue. You're like, I can drag forever. So for trackpads and mice and tablets, for everything, this makes more sense. I don't really know why other programs don't do it. But meh. It feels a little bit less user-friendly or intuitive at first, but it's so much more convenient. So, clicking, dragging up, and then rotating around the point that you clicked on. So nice. So usually you can expect to get a good track at 70%. So if you are unsure how many pixels, how many percent you should choose, 70 is always a good value. If you're pretty sure it can use more, it should be more solid, then use higher values, but I usually never go higher than 90. And if you feel like, oh no, there could be more things that are irritating it, then you take a lower value, like 30, 40, 50, something like this. You can, of course, also just click inside it and type in a value yourself. Next, we can tell it what it should track. It starts from the top, and everything that you choose enables everything that is underneath it. So for instance, if I disable the scale, everything underneath it is also disabled. If I enable shear, or if I enable rotation, then everything between here is also enabled. So this is sort of a hierarchy. Each step means I track more and more and more. Translation is just the position that we track. Scale, well, the scale, rotation is also quite clear. Shear means, do you know what shear is? It's like this. Shear is usually used when you are not quite sure if your surface is really flat, or when you track something that moves not in a realistic 3D perspective. Like if you, for instance, have the skin, a cheek or something that you track to add a scar or something like this. Then this is a pretty round thing. If the person speaks, then this distorts, but not in a 3D way, but just in some way. Then you should use shear. If we are, however, sure that the element does not distort, but really moves in a 3D perspective around, then we want to enable perspective, because then it gives us a much more accurate track. So if something moves organically distorts, then you should not use perspective. Then you might get some weird results, and you get better results with the shear. And if you know that your surface is pretty flat, it does not distort, it moves in a realistic way, then we can enable perspective. Even though the leaf is not perfectly flat, it does move in a logical way, so we can turn on perspective and we should get better results than if we don't have it enabled. Next, we have large motion, small motion, and manual track. 99% of the time, you will have a large motion. The only place you have a small motion is if you have something like this. This is a small motion. So if you really just have something that jitters, or like a vibration, like if you have something on a tripod and it just vibrates a little bit, that's a small motion. Everything more than that is already large. So here, not much to choose, just large. Manual track is if you have frames where Mocha cannot track at all because the element is completely covered by something else. Then we could say, all right, so don't track here, but I can tell you where the element is a couple of frames later. And then it creates a manual animation from the one point to the other. But that's a pretty advanced technique. So in most cases, just large motion and you're fine. The search area should be defined automatically, so we don't really have to change anything there. The last buttons here define what we can export. But right now, we did not track anything, so we cannot export anything. Let's take a look at our viewer up here. First, we see we have a timeline and a slider. If I drag the slider, I can see how I play through the video. back and forth. Down here, we have some information about where we are in the timeline. This is the in point of the timeline, this is the out point, and this is where we are right now. Not so important for us. Generally, just don't touch these. Then we have the play buttons, which lets us play forward, play backwards, play it one frame at a time, or jump to the end or the beginning. By default, a timeline in Mocha also plays back and forth automatically. So when I reach the end here, I hit the spacebar, it plays to the end, and then it plays backwards. Then we have fairly similar buttons here, and these are now referring to the track, which is why they have a T on them. We can track it one frame at a time, or we can track it continuously. In this case, I think I can just track it continuously. I hit this button, and I can see how it now says tracking layer 1 into frame 13, 14, 16, and so on. This usually takes a little while. It always depends on how large our footage is, how large the area is that we have selected with the X-spline, and how high the value is that we choose here. So if I choose a lower value here, and if I, for instance, don't track perspective, this will go through much, much quicker, but it will also be less accurate. So this takes a little bit, but it will give us a pretty good result. While it's doing that, I can clearly see how it's nicely taking my mask and moving it along with what the leaf does. If I disable this, and for now I will just set the out point here and zoom into the timeline. So I only have a shorter area here that I work with. When I play this back in a moment in real time, for some reason, when it's tracking, it's not loading the images into the RAM, so it needs to load them again, and that always takes a long time. But when it's in a moment played through everything, then it plays back and forth in real time. And it should play back and forth in real time from now on. So you can see the leaf moves in a 3D perspective, but the mask follows along with it quite nicely. I can judge this even better if I turn on the surface. The surface is the element that I will export. So somehow I need to get this tracking data out of Mocha and into After Effects. And what Mocha actually tracks is super abstract. We never see what Mocha actually tracks. It just tracks this image changes like this. But it's not just a position that we can grasp. It's some weird algorithm. And what we can then say, all right, so you know how each frame changes in its perspective. And then we can just take this here, for instance, and I could place this on the leaf. And then Mocha will take this surface and it will distort it based on the algorithm. So when I now play this back, this moves along with the leaf, and we can see how it also moves along with the perspective. So we don't have to define, before we track, what is the exact surface of what it should track. We just say, this is the area, track it, and afterwards we can say, all right, so I think the surface is like this. We can even turn on this grid, and then it looks super fancy, and we get even more the feeling of the perspective that is changing. So, we now have different options of what we can get out of this. First, we can get out of this just a simple null object. So we would have something similar to the point track that I did earlier. For that, I would need to have my layer selected, then I go to export tracking data, and here I have a drop down. And this is just transform data. I could say copy to clipboard, go over to After Effects, and then I need something that I can paste this onto. I hit Command-Alt-Shift-Y to create a solid, make sure that I'm at the beginning of the timeline, this is very crucial, and then I hit Command-V. The reason why I'm at the beginning of the timeline is because whenever I paste from where the slider is. So now when I hit U, I can see how this entire area that I've worked with in Mocha, I did not track the entire thing as you might remember, gets pasted in here. If I undo and my slider is here, and I then hit paste, now my keyframes are also over here. So it's not in sync with what the actual camera motion is. So I need to make sure that I paste it from the beginning of the timeline. And now this moves along with the leaf. And the nice thing is it also has tracked the scale and rotation. So I had even less work than with the point tracker, because I did not have to move this little point and have to think about a search area and stuff like this. I just say this. Do your thing. I could then create some text layer. I think there's, oh no, nothing is missing. Make it a little bit smaller, and then I could parent it to the null. And when I play this back, it moves pretty nicely along with it, scales and rotates and everything. Then the next thing that we have is the corner pin that we can export. There are two types of corner pins that can be exported. Here we have After Effects corner pin only, and After Effects corner pin supports motion blur. That one down here is sort of a lie, and you never have to use it. What this one exports is a corner pin and also position data. Because a corner pin, as we know, could not create motion blur. We had this issue with, in our last class when we did the animation, I think with a circle, where it did not create motion blur because it was no motion. And what this one does is, it creates a track based on position, scale, and rotation. Because of that, it generates motion blur, and then it adds a corner pin just to make sure that the perspective is right. So much like we did with the poster earlier. So it gives you a corner pin, and it does support motion blur, but it's really uneasy to handle because you have so many keyframes. You have the corner pin, the position, the scale, the rotation. It's just messy. Doing it with a regular corner pin is much nicer, and if we convert the regular corner pin into a power pin, then it's even better because then it gets motion blur, even without the force motion blur. But I'll talk about that some other time more. For now, I just copy this to the clipboard. And here I would need something that I can paste this information onto. So for instance, a solid. I will make it comp size, hit OK, make sure that I'm at the beginning of the timeline, and I hit Command V to paste. When I then play this back, it is exactly where I tell the corner pin to be. What we have to be aware of, though, is how the corner pin actually works. Let's take another example. Let's say I have a smaller solid, like this, 500 by 500 pixels. And I paste this on, and suddenly it looks like this. So it kind of moves how it should, but it's completely offset. Do you have any idea why that could be?
Maybe you changed the surface?
No. It has something to do with a layer. It's kind of a mean question, especially at this hour. The corner pin has not many properties. It only has the option, where is each corner? In effect, always thinks in relationship to its own layer. So this layer has its anchor or has its 0, 0 position in its top left corner. Mocha does not know where this layer exists. So Mocha can only calculate from this top left corner. So when we pasted it onto a layer that had the composition size, here it worked fine, because there the origin of the layer was the same as the composition's origin. But when I now have a different layer, then suddenly the origin is different. What we could do though is we could go to the Align panel and just align the layer to the left and to the top. And now it sits again in the correct spot. What we also notice is the end result is exactly the same. And it doesn't matter if we start with a square or if we start with a 16 by 9 solid. Which also means now it's getting a little bit complicated. Which also means if I, for instance, take the poster that we have here, and I want to use that one, I would drop it in. I would then make sure that it's in the top left corner, and I would paste it. But then the entire image is stretched to the surface that I have defined. Make sense? All right. So this is how the corner pin works. It always starts from the top left corner, and it calculates where each of these 4 corners should sit. And it doesn't matter where they come from originally. It just tells these corners to be there. All right, so how could I place something on the leaf without distorting it? Because it's kind of hard to judge based on this solid, based on this surface here, how much this needs to be distorted in order to match the layer that I want to attach to it. The solution is we don't match it at all. We just match this to the entire composition. And then we use a layer that has the size of the composition. Bear with me. This all makes a little bit of sense. I'm at the beginning of the timeline, so this is my master frame, sort of. And I click this button. This button pushes, when we look closely, the corners of my surface all the way to the edge here. I copy this to the clipboard. Then, back in After Effects, I need to have a composition with my poster in it. And the composition needs to be the size of the poster. So I can take this. I could rotate this around. So I'm like, this is now on the leaf. This is what I want. So I select the poster and I convert it into a composition. I make sure that I say move all attributes. So I get a composition exactly in the size of my main composition. I also have a corner pin that has exactly this same size. So nothing that forces something to be smaller. But on this frame, my surface says to be that size. In Mocha, if I play this back, it starts to look a little bit weird, like this. And it looks like it's super jerky and weird, but it's completely fine. Because if we go here, and if I paste this corner pin on the first frame, it looks like nothing happened. I think I want this to be rather a little bit more on the left. But when I now play this back, magically, this is now matching. It's magic. All up to the point where I did not track it anymore. The really nice thing about this is, I think I showed you the example with a hole in the street. So you can actually also take a still frame, do something in Photoshop with a layer, and just put it back on here. So for instance, I can take the first frame, and I could say, I take this out, I save it out. The easiest solution is making sure that this is set to full, hitting Control-Tab, and clicking this button here. Then you create a snapshot. When you click this, it opens up in a gallery. I don't know why it doesn't work on my machine. I don't have that issue on any other one. Then you can just select the image and hit copy. and then you can open it up in Photoshop. The other alternative would be to go to composition, save frame as file, as a Photoshop file. I just put it on the desktop, call it leaves, and hit render. Photoshop, not 40, there. And then I could draw on this, do a content-aware fill on this, put the still image on there, put it in the same composition, and then it will be just on the leaf. So let's take a look. So in here I could say, maybe I don't like how this is dirty. I create a new layer, hit J, make sure that I sample all layers, and I get rid of that brown stuff there. And maybe I don't like how we see this white thing in the middle, or that, or this, and that. So now I have a Photoshop file which contains all the fixes that I did. Maybe I do something a little bit more extreme. Maybe I do a dodge and burn, and does it actually work on a layer? No. That's such a shame. I thought I could just, meh, whatever. Then I just paint. Yay. So this is now my Photoshop layer. I save this file, and I import it just the way that it is. I hit Command I, or drag and drop it would also work. And I import it without layers, just as footage. I can put it into this composition. So it's just this stuff here. But when I go over here and turn it on, it has my retouches in it and the smiley face. And when I hit the space bar, it just moves along with it. And this is how beauty retouches are made. So when you have a pimple or something like this, you can just actually do the content-aware fill from Photoshop and just very easily track it onto any surface. So, now I explained how this works, and I would say we will do this example in our next class. We will also talk a little bit about masking techniques, so we can put the SpongeBob face on it, as well as the guy. And maybe in our next class we will also do another fun thing that we can do with Mocha and tracking, because it's really cool. Also, stabilizing is pretty awesome. So if we have this, we can also super stabilize this. Have you ever seen things where an element that should be moving is not moving? Like a woman with big boobs that bounces, but only the boobs are not moving, but the rest is bouncing?
Oh, that's like when the car is driving.
Or when the car is driving and it does the twist, but the whole world does the twist and not the car. The same thing we can do here now too. Because we have tracked this, we can just say, all right, so we go to Mocha, and then we say we export this tracking data, but this time we will say we invert it. Then I can say copy to clipboard, go back here, paste it. It looks like nothing has happened, but when I now hit the space bar, I now have this leaf super stabilized. So everything around it moves, but the leaf stays exactly in its place.
Kind of looks like the effect from the drone you get on the corner. Is that
Yeah.
smart?
This effect was also used, for instance, in the second Sherlock Holmes film with Robert Downey Jr. There's this one scene with the cannons where they run through the woods, And there were a lot of shots where they were attached to the head, exactly, and they could not have filmed it like that. So they filmed it just as close as possible, and then they used a program to track the head, and then just, yeah.
There's also a scene in Kendrick Lamar's Humble music video where it's like, yeah, not moving. But
Yeah. And this is how you do it. As you can see, pretty simple, actually. Just saying this is the head, track it, invert it, paste it, done. All right. I hope you can see how magical tracking can be, how many different appliances there are. And this example here we will do then first thing in our next class, and I will think of another example that we can do with Mocha. All right, that's it for today.
Thank you.